Good evening. My name is Michael Owens. I am the program and director of programs and special events at the Oklahoma Conference of Churches. We want to thank you for joining us tonight. We have a great panel. Our discussion will revolve around gun violence. So, what is the role of faith communities and other organizations in response to the incidents of gun violence throughout our community? And we are so fortunate to have with us tonight two or three individuals that can speak directly to this topic. And starting off, we have Mary Lee, we have Pastor Juan Price, and we have Dr. Robin Myers with us. And so, Mary, could you briefly tell us a little bit about yourself and the organization that you represent?
Um, I represent the Norman Peace Team, and I'm a retired school teacher. And there are a group of us. It's a small group, but there are over 100 of us on our that follow us on our Facebook page. And we got together back in 2020, probably September or October before the election, because there was just too much disrespect and hostility in the rhetoric around the election and in our own community. And then with the murder of George Floyd and the marches and things that we did in our community around Black Lives Matter, it just seemed to be a big need for us to be advocates for peace and to provide a peaceful presence within our own community. Our community, as well as the nation, has been less and less civil. And I think most communities are seeing that. And so, what could we do about it? And the decision that we made was that we would form a peace team and train ourselves to be able to be present to other organizations when they felt like they were where there was a possibility of there to be some hostility directed at them. Um, to be accompanist to accompany people after meetings when they felt like they might be accosted, to provide listening sessions with community leaders so that we could all hear what each community leader was combating and what their concerns were, uh, and just better inform ourselves as a community. And then we, right now, we're focusing on education, and so we are providing a workshop on nonviolent communication and how you step into a situation where uh, maybe someone's being hostile towards you or hateful towards you or angry at you, and how do you communicate? How do you diffuse those situations? What do you say, and how do you say it? And what's the technique? Because there is an established structured technique that folks can learn that can teach them how to diffuse a situation. And so we've had training with the DC Peace team, which is out of Washington, and with another peace team called the Meta Peace team. They trained us. Now we're training the people in our community, and that's beginning to grow. We're beginning to have more people ask us to do that, and we're glad to do that. We all do it as a volunteer in a volunteer status, but we're here serving a duty to our ancestors and a duty to our children to change the world if we can. So, every little thing makes a difference. So this is our small contribution.
So Mary, is this work mainly done in Norman?
So far, it has only been done in Norman. We, I was just interviewed on Monday by an organization out of Princeton University, and she asked if we would go into the metropolitan area or into the state. We meet actually tomorrow, and I'm going to bring that up to see if they're willing to take our training outside of the Norman area. So I will know that answer tomorrow.
Very nice, very nice. And thank you, my good friend, Pastor Juan Price.
Yes, thank you, Michael. Again, my name is Juan Price, and I'm here in Oklahoma City representing the faith community in Oklahoma City. But I pastor at Powerhouse Church. I have been there for a little over 30 years, serving as the lead pastor. And also, I would add this: is we have a former educator, Mary, that in 2002 I founded my own academy, reaching young people who, the best way that I would describe it, they had worn out their welcome in the public school system. And with that, a lot of them carry anger and things, and had a hard time, Mary, expressing themselves. And so they went the route of violence, is to try to express their feelings. And so had that little bit of background with the academy, my church, and also just being a community activist, really believing that we as faith-based organizations should have the loud voice in speaking to nonviolent approaches to hostility that we see rampant in our nation. Thank you, Michael.
Dr. Myers.
Hi, Michael. Thank you for inviting me to participate in this. I've been in Oklahoma City as the pastor of Mayflower Church for 35 years and retired a couple of years ago and thought I was done being a minister, and then was called to the pulpit of the First Congregational Church of Norman. And I'm just loving those people and the work they're doing. And I can't wait to get involved with Mary in the work she's doing. And I also am on the faculty of Oklahoma City University in the philosophy department. And I sort of represent the progressive, I think, wing of Christianity as well as I can in the state of Oklahoma. So thanks for inviting me.
The progressive wing.
Yes.
I like the ring of that. Situated right now, as we have this discussion, it is clear that Oklahoma is among one of the leaders in the nation of gun violence. And so we know that it is a pertinent discussion for us to have tonight. And so, Mary, I want to start with you. And just if you could talk a little bit about kind of the dealing with your organization and your experience, the work that's being done in the prevention of gun violence that you've seen and that you've been part of, that you know of.
Well, the training that we have had and the training that we actually provide fits in any hostile situation, whether there's a weapon or not. The question of your safety is going to be different if there's a weapon. And the question of whether you have chosen to use your skills is something that you have to decide when you're in that situation. And it just kind of depends on the situation and how it's escalating and how well you know the people involved and just what the circumstances are. So I don't see anything different in what we teach and what we train in whether there's a gun or any other weapon or not. The training is the same. And we think that nonviolence is just a way of life for courageous people. And our goal is to find understanding and to make sure that we don't dehumanize a victim or the person who's the aggressor. And so we're always in the techniques that we use. We are affirming we use a model, kind of a recipe, and it works it works well for us in the situations that we've been in. And it's just a therapeutic model. And the woman that teaches with me when we teach this workshop of ours, it's called Speak to Me, Listen to Me, Skills for Peacemakers in a World of Conflict. The woman that teaches with me is a therapist. She's been a therapist for her whole career. So she adds the therapeutic component and teaches the nonviolent communication component. And I usually teach the active bystander intervention component. Your question, did I answer it when I just said that the techniques wouldn't be any different?
Yes, I think you did, and I'm sure you're going to elaborate a little bit more as we move on into
Okay.
Pastor Price, moving to the faith community, what would you say the role of the faith community in the prevention of violence?
I think that the role of the faith community is to make sure that it positions itself out front to be leaders, to be leading activists, advocates for nonviolence. In the faith community, it should not be named among us that we are the instigators of violence. And so our role is to speak peace from our platforms, to help our listeners, our followers, to know that there's a better way to handle conflicts. But the faith community has to be like the salt and the light in these areas.
You know, two things. The mention the activists, and I know that term or identifier is tossed around a lot in this society. I know Angela Davis spoke about she's not even considered an activist today. With I thought that was funny with all of with everyone being one. You think we would solve some of our problems, but peace. I think that's, we have an absence of peace, not only in our country, but in our society. And it's something that we rarely talk about is peace and love and understanding. So Dr. Myers, what do you think that role should be?
Well, I think, first of all, we should start with some basic premises that we all share in faith communities. And we claim to value life, and we try to advance life and keep people. We heal people. We try to keep them alive. So we start with the premise that creation is good, and that, to put it simply, love is better than hate and peace is better than war, because life is better than death. We're not neutral on these things. Jesus of Nazareth said, "I come that you may have life and have it abundantly." He did not say, "I come that you would have death by guns and have it abundantly." So having said this, there are all these different approaches because there are so many different different expressions of Christianity. There are the Quakers, the Mennonites, and the Amish, who are essentially pacifists. And I think you can strongly argue that Jesus was a pacifist also. And they reject violence as a way of solving problems, period. Other traditions actually prize violence if it brings the desired results. So this all comes back to theology again and again. I mean, there are churches in this country whose pastors encourage their members to bring guns to church. And in other churches, like the one I pastored, we prohibited any guns from being anywhere on church property. So you can see what a wide divide we have in faith communities. But again, I think it comes back to theology. If your theology is essentially nonviolent and based on the teachings of Jesus, the Prince of Peace, it is going to be in conflict with churches that actually endorse violence and portray God as someone who sometimes, goes after God's enemies, and may even have a theology about the death of Jesus that indicates that God has sent his only son solely for the purpose of dying to save us all from our sins, which makes some of us feel like God is a divine child abuser. So I'm going to continue to say in this conversation, theology is a huge and important part of the violence that some faith communities are actually fostering and encouraging and even giving some divine sanction to.
I think it's very interesting, Doc, that you bring up theology and the infusion of politics and political ideology into faith communities and how that is steering theology, not based upon a text, but based upon some sort of political belief, whether it is conservative or liberalism. So let's talk a little bit, Mary, about the active ways that we can be personally, that we can be instruments of anti-violence. So if a person says, "How man, I believe in nonviolence. How can what can I do?" So what would you say to those people that are listening, Mary?
I want to say something else to at the end of Robin's comments, was that Jesus, he stepped right into that political arena. He stepped right into the forest and let them get him. And in the end, he that act was able to let people see the difference in who Caesar was and who Jesus was. So what can we do? I think we can learn new things. We can open our minds, and we can learn skills. And I think that those of us that are not tribal or are trying not to be tribal, then it's up to us to be role models and to be teachers of the skills that allow people to see that there's a different way. And so that's what Peace Team is all about, and that's what we're doing. So if you say to me that you're against violence, then I might have lots of questions for you about what that means, what that exactly means to you. And if we get to the point where I have listened long enough and let you tell my story, then my question to you at that point would be to say, well, will you listen to something that my thoughts on this, and then to tell my story? So I think that's the answer that I give to you.
Thank you. Thank you. When you were talking, it occurred to me that, we live in a violent society, and, we have a police department across the country that have been guilty of some pretty violent acts, although they have, I think, across the country have done some wonderful things in protecting the lives of those they serve. But it does not discount the negative things that have happened. And so we live in a violent society. Pastor Price, what can that individual do when you're raised in an environment? You might be raised in, and there's violence everywhere. So I'm not going to say that just inner city. There's violence in the suburbs and in more affluent places. So often we're hearing now that this has never happened here before. So what would you say, being a faith leader, to an individual that wants to be part of anti-violence?
That's a very good question in these times that we're living, because I think at the root of so much violence, so much of the upheaval and is that there's selfishness, and people really believe that they have a right to do whatever's best they feel for themselves, and so it's all self-centeredness. And so one of the things that I think that has been my mission when I talk to people is to help them understand that it's not just about an individual. And again, it's hard to talk to some people, particularly some young people, because they feel that the best way to be heard is to be loud and violent. And so we try to communicate with them again that love is a better way. Sometimes it's going to be self-sacrificial. You're going to incur sometimes being abused or not being fully understood. But if we stay on this path of seeking to get a better understanding, I think that's the key. Seeking to get a better understanding, and that I have not seen violence lead us to good answers. I have not seen it happen. So we must pursue nonviolence and the way of peace and love to get to the desired end where we want to go. Thank you.
Thank you. This idea of peace and love, I mean, that's, it's the flower child. How does that benefit me in this society, this capitalist society where I have to work so hard to get ahead and I have to watch my back because nobody's watching my back. So you talk about peace and love, but my reality is not peace and love. So, Doc, how do you talk to individuals like that?
Well, I think this is, again, a theological divide we have. There's, on the one hand, this movement to create a sort of hyper masculine, Superman Christianity, where you know how to control the women in your lives and you are heavily armed and you're a man's man. And I don't know what any of that has to do with Jesus. I mean, this all gets back to just reading the gospel and studying it instead of waving the Bible around over your head. And I think there's some things we can do personally to be instruments of nonviolence. That's all we can do, anti-violence. The most obvious thing we can do is stop acting violently ourselves, control our anger, and put down our weapons, whether they are guns or gossip. We used to sing a song at the end of our church service that said, "Let there be peace on earth and let it begin with me," because violence begins at home, and we should stop glorifying violence in sports. I think extreme cage fighting may not be an advance for the human species personally, but we can and we should reject violence in all forms in our everyday life and stop talking about political opponents as our enemies who deserve to die. And we can stand up and tell the truth about our fascination, our idolatry of guns. We idolize guns. We've made idols of them, and they're actually demonic things. Again, as if there's some extension of our manhood, and that anyone who recognizes that we are now literally slaughtering one another, and that to try to change this is somehow un-American, but we as faith leaders want the killing to stop. So we can also reject, as people of faith, this false premise that more guns will make us safer, which has been the operative premise of the National Rifle Association for 50 years. Sarah Brady said, if more guns would make us safer, then wouldn't we already be the safest nation on earth? So what do Christians think the Old Testament prophet Joel meant when he said we should beat our swords into plowshares and our spears into pruning hooks? It surely did not mean that we should build and sell even more fantastic swords like AR-15s and then sell them to teenagers whose brains are not even fully formed. So violence will not stop until we stop glorifying violence, which means first and foremost glorifying guns and gun culture.
Yeah, I have a follow-up question for you, Don. Do you, and I want the panel to address this too. Do you think, because I think while there's levels to this, right? So I can talk to people on my level. The pastorate is another level. The imam is another level. Do you think we have people in positions to really speak to this nonviolent movement that's needed so much once again in our country, or are we seeing people that have the bully pulpit that, you know, there's absence of peace from their conversation? So I'm speaking more to leadership. How do you see? Do we have it? What do we need in leadership, and so forth?
Well, I think what Reverend Price said is true, that we are an enormously selfish and narcissistic culture. And so we're always going to look out for ourselves. That includes defending ourselves. And therefore, our theology is all about what can God do for me, not how God sends me out to be a servant for the common good. So we're just all, I mean, and as far as political leadership is concerned, Michael, we've just lived through a nightmare of bad political leadership from the very top, in which violence was advocated directly from the mouth of the president again and again and again. And that's what young people thought presidents should do, is they should insult people and bully people and say, you need to go beat that person up. I mean, it was a nightmare. And then that same person walks across the park, Lafayette Park in Washington, D.C., to have a photo op holding up a Bible. I mean, we are in such bad shape theologically that we're going to have to reset ourselves. We're not going to be able to depend on some savior to come along and save us politically. That is a mistake. And the church is in terrible shape because young people look at this and they say, well, why would I want to be part of a beloved community that is really not beloved, or a peace community that is really not peaceful? So it is a crisis, but I think it's also an opportunity. And each of us will just have to do what we can, where we are with what we have, as Mother Teresa put it. And that includes not participating in violence in any form ourselves, and not owning guns and telling our congregations we don't own guns. And if someone says, well, then you're a sitting duck, someone's going to come in and take you out, then we can say, yes, that is possible. But I consider the threat of a country saturated with firearms to be much more dangerous than me taking the risk of not having a gun in my house. And we just get it started one step at a time.
You know, there's more guns in America than people, actually, which is a terrible statistic. Mary, your thoughts on that leadership?
Well, and our country is the largest producer and seller of guns in the whole world. I think it's like 58% of all weapons come from our country. I'll go back to what Reverend Price said about sacrifice. As Christians, we're going to have to make some sacrifices. And Dr. Myers, I agree with you. We've got to work towards the common good. But as people that are, I happen to be a church person, a church lady, and I think we have to believe that churches, if we were to organize together, we could be powerful and we could change the world. We have to believe that. And that hope that we have, that's a Christian hope, I think is what leads us to that belief. And so that's what I have to say about that.
Thank you, Pastor Price.
You know, it's interesting tonight. The first time that Dr. Myers spoke, he says, I'm going to mention theology, and you probably hear me mention it several times. Well, I thought I heard him the first time he said it. But after about the third time, it hit me at a deeper level that, this really is profound, because what is happening, folk who are saying that they are Christian and say that we are a Christian nation have formed a theology that is, you cannot find it being properly aligned with the Bible, with the gospel of Jesus Christ that he spoke. So I think that is very true, and that and so when you think about that, and that many politicians will share a twisted theology that intermingles with their political viewpoint and leave the uninitiated person confused and thinking that, well, maybe this is the way to do things. So I'm not sure if I hit it on the head what you were asking, but I think that when we talk about America being founded on Christian principles, we really have to go back and do some foundational work again and make sure, again, as you said, Dr. Myers, that we come up with a proper theology, some beliefs, principles, and practices. We got to start practicing what we preach, so that if they don't hear us, they can watch us and look at us and see what they should do.
That's right. And you should keep preaching that, Reverend Price. It is all about who you think God is, what you think God wants for creation, what we want for each other, and not let somebody hijack our essential message or the message of other great faith traditions in the service of keeping people afraid so that you can control them, so you can get their vote. I mean, that is really evil. But it's happening all around us. And these are people that have never studied theology or care about theology, or are not themselves people who ever actively think about the tension between violence and nonviolence. We know what violence gets us: more violence. But as Dr. King said, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. So we're going to hang in there, and we're going to believe that someday, the lion will lie down with the lamb.
What I'm going to say, and then we have a question here from a listener. What I'm going to say is America was birthed in violence. And we are a nation, while we like to say that we're a Christian nation, but we're a nation of multiple faiths. And all of those faith traditions make up the beauty of this country. And so I think it's hard to change the trajectory of a nation when you were birthed in violence. So that's the kind of the challenge, right? That all faiths traditions try to combat. Our listener says, what are faith groups in Oklahoma doing to address gun legislation, specifically the anti-red flag law on the books in Oklahoma? The officer who was killed, shooter's mothers had a pending VPO on the shooter. So what is, if you know of any activism that the faith community is doing, or even the peace community is doing when it comes to legislation? Anyone?
Well, Mary, your group is obviously doing work as Moms Against Gun Violence. There's a woman in my church that belongs to Moms Against Gun Violence. You have to know your representatives. You have to communicate with them. You have to have your voice heard, and you have to show up at the state capitol when there are rallies against gun violence, and make sure that the people who lead us don't think that we don't exist. And especially faith leaders, it's very confusing for conservatives, especially, to have clergy adopt a position that sort of is outside the box of what they think clergy are supposed to believe, or that they're supposed to stay out of politics, period. Okay. So we have to be politically involved and not think that politics is so broken and God-forsaken that we can't pay attention, because they depend upon us not to pay attention or to give up and just stop caring.
Yeah. I'd like to add this. Last week in Norman, we had a city council meeting in which we were voting on the opportunity to provide a low-income housing for individuals. I think there's lots of family low-income housing in Norman, but not very much for individuals. So there was a facility that we were able to consider purchasing as a city, and had the money to do it. And we had a contingency of the council disagreeing with it. It passed, but I was thinking, as I was listening to the reasons that folks were disagreeing with the idea, that I wished we had a person of faith that was a recognized pastor or recognized in some way associated with faith to speak to that issue. And we didn't. Would have been nice to have seen that, because I think it would have really been influential.
Mary, please call me next time.
I will.
Pastor Price.
That's good. And I don't want to try to speak from a authoritative position, because I'm not certain as to what all is being done as far as the faith-based community. But there are some streams of people who are trying to get in and influence what's going on. I think that we just need maybe a stronger rallying cry. We certainly need more unity, so that people will not, those who are in the faith-based community would not feel that they are so broken and separated, and then begin to feel overwhelmed. So I'm not sure exactly how many are really actively involved in influence and legislation, but I know that there are some who are out there being the path.
And I think that preachers need to get in their pulpits and challenge the falsehoods that Oklahoma is infested with because of special interests like the National Rifle Association. They say, one, more guns will make us safer, and that's demonstrably false. They say the only thing that'll stop a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun. Truth of the matter is, we don't know who the bad guys are and the good guys are until it's too late. And there's just this deep disconnect in logic. There's no other country in the world that would put up with the slaughter of its fellow citizens that's going on in this country right now and not be outraged. But the NRA owns the lawmakers, and they protect gun manufacturers. And so what happens to the voice of the people in that transaction? It's been shut out for a very, very long time. And we have to just start making some noise.
I think it's, the leadership that all of you speak of, or the lack thereof, of the negative influence upon leadership, I think is devastating to the anti-violence movement in this country. And I think we no longer see examples of that. We see more examples of violence than we do nonviolence. And that at one time in this country, we saw a lot of during the civil rights movements, the women's rights movements, the LGBTQ plus movements. We've seen nonviolence at work, right? And we don't see that today. And I think because we're so divided, not just as faith communities, but as other organizations working toward this same goal. And it's going to take leadership. It's going to take not the congregants or no, it's going to take those that have the pulpit, those that have the mic, as Doc has talked about, getting up and speaking to these things very forcefully. And I think I heard in this panel that, and I think it was Mary that said, you got to be willing to lose something or sacrifice something, or, there's a price to pay that I just don't think people are willing to pay anymore. I want to talk about those who are affected by gun violence or violence in general. How do we, speaking from your perspective, how do we be there for them, right? How do we, because these are tough situations. We don't know what to say, how to respond a lot of times. How should we respond to, the victims, the families of victims of this? And anyone can go first.
I'd like to give it a shot just to get this started, because I actually think Oklahomans do this very well already. And by that, I mean showing up for other people when tragedy strikes. We're good at that, and we repeatedly show that we're good at that. We care about what happens to our neighbors when something terrible happens to our neighbors. But we're not very good at being proactive about systems that cause tragedies to begin with. We are reactive. So we pitch in when the tragedy strikes, but we give far less attention to what is causing it in the first place. So the great preacher William Sloane Coffin said once, it's fine for people of faith to pull drowning people out of the river, but somebody needs to go upstream to see who or what is throwing them in. And I must confess that the most terrifying thought to me these days is that we have all begun to regard gun tragedy after gun tragedy as somehow inevitable and normal. And because mass shootings are now as routine as sunrise and sunset. And to me, that is demonic. I would like preachers to talk about guns as demonic again. That's another theological issue for me. So we just can't go gently into this good night, as Dylan Thomas put it. We've got to rage against the dying of the light. So showing up is not just to help clean up. It's also fearless and relentless efforts to change whatever brings death and destruction to those we love. We had over 42,000 Americans killed by guns last year, nearly half of them by suicide. And if any other object, any product that's bought and sold caused this much death and misery, it would be banned anywhere else in the world. So we can't even get politicians to insist that guns are registered, like so many other things, much less regulated. I think we've lost our minds. If we as leaders and participants of faith communities cannot even agree now that guns are the ultimate merchants of death in our culture, then what does it mean to say we are pro-life? We can't find male politicians to run in Oklahoma who haven't been beating their wives. I mean, I'm being asked to vote for someone who had a restraining order placed against him, and candidate after candidate on the Republican side ends up having domestic violence in their background. So what does that mean that they think about? How do they think about women and about violence as a way to solve problems at home? I mean, we have to get real about this ourselves and for those whose opinions we disagree with. The NRA is fond of saying guns don't kill people. People kill people. But the truth is people with guns kill people.
And we have to be courageous enough to get real about it. in some instances with leadership, it's a point of courage, I think.
And during the time that I'm in comfort, things have not come to my front door, does not mean that I should be passive. Oftentimes people, again, going back to what you're saying, Dr. Myers, we react, and so rather than being proactive. So when things are not chaotic in my personal space, then I tend to just go on and say everything's, it's okay. And I think that we have to, yes, be proactive. And I'll speak from as an African-American male, Michael, perhaps you can attest to this, that as African-American people, sometimes we used to hear certain things on the news and say, well, that couldn't have been a black person who did that. We don't do things like that. And that script has certainly changed in that any people now are prone to do anything if they are left to go by their own inclinations. And so we have to understand that. But I think that what we have to do when somebody has gone through some kind of tragedy is practice the power of presence. Just, show up, be there. Sometimes we want to preach too much, have too much to say. Sometimes just show up, just be there for that person who has gone through some tragedy as a result of violence. And then let's be good and active listeners. Let's listen. And I would say thirdly, let's seek to serve rather than to be served.
Could I add also, and this is another theological issue, like Dr. Myers has brought up time and time again. As Christians, we've got to quit having a focus on saving souls and saving our own soul. We've got to make heaven on earth. And we've got to be concerned about the common good. We've all three mentioned that already. But that heaven on earth is what we're called to create. And it's got to be done with active Christians and not passive Christians.
Mary, you remind me of a quote by Dr. King, and I'll paraphrase it. He talks about the church that is more concerned about saving souls than the condition of the person. And he calls that church moribund. And he said it's ready to close its doors. And so, yes, you're absolutely right.
And Michael, there's about 9 churches on average that close their doors every day in the United States. The implosion of organized religion, where the handwriting is on the wall, is really overwhelming. And it may be that is a judgment on what the church has become. And young people are rejecting it. So we could look at that as a crisis, or we could look at it as an opportunity. And we really may have to reset and start doing our theology all over again.
Yeah, and in closing, and this has been a great discussion, and having all of you here, I think this is going to, again, be viewed by a lot of people. Doc, you bring up young people, and that has been sticking in my mind throughout this whole conversation because, we have life left in us, but we're not as young as we used to be. So, what do you think about how do we get young people involved? And Mary, do you see young people coming into Norman Peace Team? Is that an initiative? But if you each could just, in closing, talk a little bit about, how do we get young people involved? Because we're going to have to pass the torch.
We see young people interested and wanting to know what we're doing on our Facebook page. But they're not the ones that are doing the work. It's the old folks that are doing the work. And maybe that's to be expected, considering that the old folks have more time to do it. But it sure would be nice if we could get the young folks doing some of the work too.
So this is the endless refrain of millions of churches. Where are the young people? How do we get the young people? Well, by your fruits you shall know them. That's someplace in there. And when young people look at Christians and see people that have gotten meaner and more judgmental and more violent than the average person, then we can't blame them for saying, well, why would I want to go to church if it's going to make me a worse person? So until we start living these things out, then I think there are a lot of young people who are deeply spiritual who might reconsider religious communities again. But when 82% of evangelical Christians vote for a man for president who is the answer to the question, what would Jesus not do, and was vile and immoral and a liar, then they say, well, so then I don't want to have anything to do with these people, and you can't blame them. So we just have to call us, look wide-eyed and honestly at the condition of the world and see if we can start rebuilding it.
I'm going to say something that I hope is not misunderstood, but I would say that if we want to reach the young people, involve the young people, that we have to stop trying to make getting them into church the top priority. What I'm saying is that church and God are not synonymous. So if our top priority is to get them in church, and what they see going on in church is not congruent with the love of God, it's not a drawing card. So we got to go beyond trying to draw them into church, but draw them into a relationship, and then also empower them. So maybe sometimes they show up, but we don't empower them. We, as old folk, we still doing it because we want to do everything, and we have we want to grasp everything and control everything. So if we're going to bring them in, also empower them and listen to them and know that their way of doing things may not be the way that I would do it, but let's look for results and see if it works.
Well, thank you all. What I'm going to take from this is a lot of things, but centrally to my mind is theological reset. Really, getting back to where we made a wrong turn, and hoping that there are faith leaders out there, community leaders out there that have the courage that's come out, the courage to reset and say, you know what, we have to get back, because if the foundation will not stand, right? Shifting sand. So thank you so much for being with us tonight, and we appreciate it and all your wisdom. It's been a pleasure, and I know it's going to bless a lot of people. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael.
It has been a great pleasure.
And I thank you too.